Two twin brothers, torn apart by a broken system and a web of lies, find themselves facing a harrowing truth: their past hides secrets darker than they ever imagined. When a single word whispered in a courtroom sets a chain of events into motion, will they find justice, or will the shadows of betrayal keep them apart forever? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The courtroom buzzed with subdued chatter as Judge Merrick Holden reviewed the morning's docket. It was a typical day at Ridgewood County Courthouse, where the cases ranged from petty disputes to heavy criminal proceedings. Yet, as the next case was called, Judge Holden felt an inexplicable shift in the air, a sense of unease he couldn't quite place. The bailiff announced the case: Elias and Kieran Black vs. Ridgewood Foster Care Agency. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and two boys walked in, accompanied by their foster parents. Elias and Kieran, 15-year-old identical twins, were eerily quiet as they approached the bench. Their thin frames and solemn expressions contrasted with the polished, impatient demeanor of the couple behind them. The foster parents sat rigidly, their eyes darting around the room as if they wanted to be anywhere else. Judge Holden's gaze lingered on the boys. There was something in their eyes, fear, desperation, that caught his attention. He glanced down at the case notes, a routine review of their foster placement. Nothing unusual on paper. But as he looked back at Elias and Kieran, he knew there was more to this story. "Good morning," he said, his voice firm but kind. "This hearing is to determine whether your current foster placement is in your best interest. Elias, Kieran, do you understand why you're here today?" Elias nodded slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Kieran glanced at his brother, then at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible. "Good," Judge Holden replied. "Now, I'd like to hear from you both. How do you feel about your current situation? Do you feel safe and cared for?" The courtroom fell silent. The twins exchanged a glance, their communication unspoken but clear. Elias swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Kieran looked down at his lap, his hands clenched into fists. Finally, Elias leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Help." The single word cut through the air like a knife. Judge Holden frowned, leaning closer. "What do you mean, help?" he asked, his tone calm but insistent. Kieran looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't go back with them," he said, nodding toward the foster parents. "Please, Your Honor. We're not safe." The room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Holden studied the foster parents, who sat stiffly, their faces frozen in thinly veiled annoyance. The man, Paul, shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The woman, Brenda, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your Honor," Brenda interjected, her tone sugary sweet, "I'm not sure what the boys mean. We've given them a stable home." Judge Holden raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'll hear from you in a moment," he said sharply. "Right now, I'm speaking to the boys." Brenda's smile vanished, and she sank back into her chair, her face darkening. Judge Holden turned his attention back to Elias and Kieran. "You're safe here," he said gently. "No one can hurt you in this room. But I need you to tell me what's going on." Elias hesitated, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the table. "They lock us in the basement," he said finally, his voice cracking. "They only let us out when they want us to clean or when someone's coming over." Kieran added, his voice steadier but filled with urgency, "They keep the money the state gives them for us. We barely get enough food. And if we talk to anyone, they threaten to make us disappear." Judge Holden's jaw tightened as he listened, his calm demeanor barely masking the anger simmering beneath the surface. He turned to the foster parents, his eyes narrowing. "Is this true?" Paul scoffed, leaning back in his chair. They're just making things up because they don't like rules. Typical teenagers. Brenda nodded quickly. Exactly. They've been difficult from the start, Your Honor. We've done our best, but they're ungrateful. Judge Holden held up a hand again, silencing them. Enough. He turned to the bailiff. Clear the courtroom. I want everyone out except the boys and their legal representatives. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people began filing out. Brenda and Paul protested, but the judge silenced them with a sharp glare. Once the room was empty, Judge Holden leaned forward, his expression softening. Elias, Kieran, he said, you did the right thing by speaking up. I need you to tell me everything, no matter how hard it is. I promise you, I will protect you. Elias's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. They said no one would believe us, he whispered. They said we were worthless. Kieran reached over, gripping his brother's hand tightly. They hurt us, Your Honor, he said. And if we go back with them, we don't think we'll make it out alive. Judge Holden's throat tightened. He turned to the bailiff, his voice steady but urgent. Call 911. I want law enforcement and child protective services here immediately. The bailiff nodded, stepping out to make the call. The twins watched him go, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. You're safe now, Judge Holden said, his voice firm. I promise, you'll never have to go back there again. For the first time, a flicker of relief crossed the boys' faces. But Judge Holden knew this was just the beginning. Whatever darkness they had endured, it was now his responsibility to ensure they never faced it again. The courtroom was silent except for the faint murmurs of the bailiff outside as he contacted law enforcement and child protective services. Inside, Judge Merrick Holden leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on the two boys sitting before him. Their earlier words, "They hurt us" and "we won't make it out alive," hung in the air like a dark cloud. Kieran fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, his lips pressed into a thin line. Elias sat motionless, his eyes focused on the tabletop, as if avoiding eye contact would make the pain disappear. Judge Holden softened his tone, knowing that whatever they had endured was more than most adults could bear. Elias, Kieran, he said gently, I need you to tell me more about what's been happening in that house. I know it's difficult, but every detail you share will help me protect you. Kieran glanced at Elias, who gave him a small nod. Taking a deep breath, Kieran began to speak. They don't see us as people, he said, his voice low but steady. To them, we're just a paycheck. They get money from the state for fostering us, but they use it on themselves, vacations, fancy clothes. We're lucky if we get one meal a day. Elias added, his voice trembling, when we don't do what they want, they lock us in the basement. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Judge Holden's jaw clenched, though he kept his expression calm. How often does this happen? He asked. Kieran hesitated, then said, at least twice a week. Sometimes more if they're in a bad mood. They say we're ungrateful and that we don't deserve better. Elias pulled up his sleeve, revealing faded bruises on his forearm. This is what happens if we talk back, he whispered. Or if we don't finish our chores fast enough. The judge took a deep breath, trying to steady the anger rising within him. He looked at the boys, his voice firm but reassuring. You didn't deserve any of this, he said. And I promise you, they won't hurt you again. Do you trust me? Kieran nodded slowly, though the wariness in his eyes remained. We don't have a choice, he said quietly. You're the first person who's actually listened. Before Judge Holden could respond, the door opened, and Detective Lila Hart stepped inside. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp features softened by kind eyes. Known for her relentless pursuit of justice, Detective Hart wasted no time introducing herself. Your Honor, she said, nodding at the judge before turning to the boys. Elias, Kieran, my name is Detective Hart. I'm here to make sure you're safe and to investigate what's been happening. The twins studied her warily, their shared mistrust of adults evident in their guarded expressions. But something in her tone, a mixture of professionalism and genuine care, seemed to ease their nerves. I've already spoken with the bailiff, Detective Hart continued. Officers are on their way to the foster home now to secure the property and gather evidence. In the meantime, I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's okay. Elias and Kieran exchanged a glance, then nodded. Detective Hart pulled out a notepad and pen, her demeanor calm and focused. Can you describe the basement? She asked. What's it like when you're locked down there? It's dark, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's no light, just concrete walls. They don't even leave us a blanket. Kieran added, there's a bucket for, if we need it. It smells awful. They don't clean it. Detective Hart nodded, her pen moving quickly across the notepad. And the doors, are they locked from the outside? Kieran nodded. They use a padlock. Sometimes they yell at us through the door, but most of the time, they just leave us there. The detective's expression darkened, though she maintained her composure. Have they ever threatened you directly? She asked. They said if we told anyone, they'd make us disappear, Elias said, his voice cracking. They said no one would care if we were gone. Judge Holden clenched his fists beneath the desk, his heart breaking for the boys. They were wrong, he said firmly. People care. I care. The boys looked at him, their guarded expressions softening just slightly. For the first time, they seemed to believe that someone might actually be on their side. Detective Hart closed her notepad and gave the boys a small, reassuring smile. You've been very brave, she said. Thank you for telling us the truth. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you're safe. As she turned to Judge Holden, her voice dropped. Your Honor, this is more serious than we anticipated. These boys are in immediate danger. We need to place them in protective custody tonight. Judge Holden nodded. Agreed. I'll issue an emergency order for their removal from the foster home. Elias and Kieran tensed at the mention of being moved. Where will we go? Kieran asked, his voice tinged with fear. Detective Hart crouched down to their level, meeting their eyes. You'll be placed somewhere safe, she said. And I'll make sure you're together. No one will separate you. The boys exchanged a glance, their fear giving way to cautious relief. For the first time in years, they felt a glimmer of hope that they might finally escape the nightmare they had been living. As the boys were escorted out of the courthouse to meet with a social worker, Judge Holden watched them go, determination etched into his features. He turned to Detective Hart. Find everything you can on those foster parents, he said. I want to make sure they never hurt another child again. Detective Hart nodded, her expression resolute. I'll make it my priority, she said. Those boys deserve justice. And as the courthouse doors closed behind Elias and Kieran, Judge Holden silently vowed to see this case through, no matter how long it took. Later that evening, Elias and Kieran sat together in a small, brightly lit office at the Ridgewood Child Protective Services building. A social worker named Mrs. Corbin, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, was explaining the process of placing them into emergency protective custody. You'll be staying in a temporary home tonight, she said, her tone calm but purposeful. It's just for a few days while we find a longer-term solution. The most important thing is that you'll be safe, and you'll stay together. Elias glanced at Kieran, his expression still guarded. Kieran nodded slightly, and Mrs. Corbin took that as a sign to continue. Detective Hart is working closely with law enforcement to investigate your case. She'll be checking in with you regularly. The boys didn't respond. They sat stiffly, their bodies tense and their hands clasped tightly in their laps. Mrs. Corbin gave them a reassuring smile. I know this is overwhelming, she said. But you're not alone in this anymore. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Detective Hart stepped inside, carrying a folder. She looked at the boys, her expression softening. Elias, Kieran, she said, can I speak with you for a moment? Mrs. Corbin nodded and stepped out, giving the detective some privacy. Hart pulled up a chair, sitting across from them. I wanted to let you know that we've secured your foster home, she said. The police found the basement exactly as you described it. They're gathering evidence to build a strong case against Paul and Brenda. Kieran's jaw tightened. They'll get away with it, he muttered. People like them always do. Detective Hart leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. Not this time, she said. The evidence is solid, and your testimony is going to make a huge difference. But I need you both to keep being brave, just like you were in court today. Elias hesitated, then asked, what happens if they try to come after us? Hart's expression darkened slightly. They won't, she assured them. They're under investigation and have been ordered to stay away from you. If they violate that order, they'll be arrested immediately. Kieran leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping slightly. It doesn't feel real, he said quietly. We've been trapped for so long. It's like, I don't know what to do now. Hart nodded, understanding the weight of his words. You take it one step at a time, she said. Right now, your only job is to focus on yourselves and to trust that the people helping you will handle the rest. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Hart reached into the folder she was carrying and pulled out a photograph. I found this in your case files, she said, sliding it across the table. It's from when you were younger, probably around 2 years old. Elias and Kieran leaned forward to look at the photo. It showed 2 toddlers sitting side by side on a blanket, both smiling brightly at the camera. They were clearly the same boys, but their faces were rounder, their eyes wide with innocence. That was before, Hart said softly. Before you were placed with Paul and Brenda. You were in the care of a different foster family at that time. Kieran frowned. Why didn't we stay with them? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Hart said. The records from your early years are incomplete. It's like someone erased parts of your history. Elias's brow furrowed. Why would they do that? Hart hesitated, then said, it could be a mistake. Or it could be intentional. Either way, I'm going to find out. The boys exchanged a glance, their unease growing. Hart noticed and quickly added, you don't need to worry about this right now. I'll handle it. But if you remember anything at all about your early years, please tell me. Kieran nodded slowly. Okay, he said. But I don't remember much. It's all a blur. That's normal, Hart said. Trauma can make it hard to recall certain things. But sometimes memories come back when you least expect them. Elias looked at the photo again, his fingers brushing over the edge. We looked happy, he said quietly. You were, Hart said. And you will be again. I promise. As the detective stood to leave, she paused by the door. You've already taken the hardest step by speaking up, she said. The rest is just about moving forward. After she left, Mrs. Corbin returned to the room, a gentle smile on her face. Are you ready to go? She asked. Elias and Kieran stood, their movements hesitant but steady. They followed her out of the building and into the night, where a car waited to take them to their temporary home. As they climbed into the back seat, Elias glanced at Kieran. Do you think she's right? He asked. That things will get better? Kieran stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. I don't know, he said honestly. But I think we have to try. Elias nodded, leaning back in his seat. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. They didn't know what the future held, but at least they weren't facing it alone. The following morning, Elias and Kieran woke up in the unfamiliar but cozy surroundings of their temporary foster home. The room they shared was small but clean, with matching twin beds and a large window that let in the early sunlight. It was a stark contrast to the dark, cold basement they had been forced to endure for years. Yet, despite the comfort, both boys felt a strange unease, as if this new reality could be taken away at any moment. Their temporary foster parent, Mrs. Larkins, was an older woman with a warm smile and a calm demeanor. She had been fostering children for over 2 decades and seemed to instinctively understand their wariness. She didn't ask many questions, letting them adjust at their own pace. That morning, she simply knocked on their door and said, "Breakfast is ready when you are, boys." Elias and Kieran dressed quickly, exchanging few words. When they came downstairs, the smell of scrambled eggs and pancakes greeted them. The kitchen table was set neatly, and Mrs. Larkins motioned for them to sit. "I didn't know what you like, so I made a little of everything," she said cheerfully. "Eat as much as you want. There's plenty." Elias hesitated before sitting, his eyes scanning the room. Kieran followed, his movements slow and deliberate. They ate in silence at first, their manners overly cautious, as if they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Mrs. Larkins noticed but didn't press. Instead, she chatted about mundane topics, her garden, her favorite recipes, the weather. Gradually, the boys relaxed, though they still didn't speak much. By the time breakfast was over, they looked a little less tense. Later that day, Detective Hart arrived to check in. She was greeted warmly by Mrs. Larkins, who directed her to the living room where the boys were sitting. Hart noticed how different they looked from the previous day. The dark circles under their eyes were still there, but their postures were slightly more relaxed. "Hi, Elias." "Hi, Kieran," Hart said, sitting across from them. "How are you settling in?" "It's nice," Elias said hesitantly. "Different. Good different or bad different?" Hart asked with a small smile. Elias glanced at Kieran, who shrugged. "Good, I guess," he replied. "But it doesn't feel real." Hart nodded, understanding. "That's normal. It's going to take time to adjust. But you're safe here, and Mrs. Larkins is one of the best." The boys nodded but didn't respond further. Hart pulled out her notebook, flipping it open. "I wanted to update you on what's happening," she said. "The police have collected a lot of evidence from Paul and Brenda's house. The padlock on the basement door, the conditions you described, it all matches your statements. It's a strong case." "Will they go to jail?" Kieran asked, his voice quiet but sharp. "That's the goal," Hart said firmly. "But it's a process. We'll need your help as witnesses, but only when you're ready. No one's going to rush you." The boys exchanged a glance, their shared understanding evident. They were hesitant but willing to do whatever it took to ensure Paul and Brenda couldn't hurt anyone else. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," Hart continued, her tone softening. She reached into her folder and pulled out another photograph. It was similar to the one she had shown them the previous day, but this one was older, more worn. "This picture was taken before you were placed with Paul and Brenda," she explained. "It's from when you were babies." Elias leaned forward, studying the photo. 2 chubby toddlers sat on a blanket, their identical smiles beaming at the camera. "That's us," he said quietly. "It is," Hart confirmed. "And I've been digging into the records from that time. It looks like you were originally placed with a different foster family. But something happened, and the paperwork is messy." "Messy how?" Kieran asked, his tone wary. "There are gaps in the records," Hart admitted. "Details are missing, like why you were moved to Paul and Brenda's care in the first place. I'm still investigating, but I wanted you to know that there's more to your story than what you've been told." Elias frowned, his fingers tracing the edge of the photo. Why would someone erase parts of our records? I don't know yet, Hart said. But I'm going to find out. And I need you both to tell me if you remember anything about your early years, anything at all. The boys were silent for a moment, thinking. Finally, Kieran said, I don't remember much. Just flashes, like someone singing to us. It was a woman, but I don't know who. Elias nodded. I remember that too. And a house, with flowers. A lot of flowers. Hart jotted down the details, her expression thoughtful. That's a good start, she said. It might not seem like much, but every little detail helps. She closed her notebook and leaned forward, her tone serious but kind. You've been through a lot, and I know it's hard to trust people after everything that's happened. But I want you to know that I'm on your side. I won't stop until I get to the bottom of this. The boys nodded, their expressions a mixture of hope and doubt. Hart stood, giving them a reassuring smile. I'll be back soon with more updates. In the meantime, focus on taking care of yourselves. You deserve that much. As she left, Mrs. Larkins returned to the living room with a tray of cookies and 2 glasses of milk. Detective Hart's a good one, she said, setting the tray on the coffee table. She'll find the answers you're looking for. Elias and Kieran each took a cookie, their movements hesitant but grateful. They didn't say much for the rest of the day, but as they sat together, the weight of their past felt just a little lighter. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, their future could be different. The following day, Elias and Kieran were escorted to the Ridgewood police station by Mrs. Larkins and Detective Hart. It was time for the twins to give their official statements about the abuse they had endured. Despite the reassurances from Hart and Mrs. Larkins, both boys were tense. The thought of reliving their experiences, even to ensure justice, weighed heavily on them. The police station was bustling with activity, officers moving purposefully from desk to desk, phones ringing incessantly. Detective Hart led them to a quieter interview room with soft lighting and a welcoming atmosphere, a stark contrast to the cold, intimidating environment they had expected. All right, boys, Hart said, her voice calm and steady. This is your space. You're in control here. Take your time, and share what you're comfortable with. Remember, you're safe. Elias and Kieran sat side by side at the small table, their shoulders brushing slightly as if to remind each other they weren't alone. A female officer named Officer Grayson joined them, her demeanor gentle and kind. Hi, Elias. Hi, Kieran, she said warmly. I'm here to listen and help. You're very brave for coming in today. Kieran glanced at Elias, his face pale but determined. We want to do this, Kieran said. If it helps stop them from hurting anyone else. Grayson nodded encouragingly. That's exactly what this will do. Take your time, and start wherever you'd like. Elias began, his voice trembling. It started almost as soon as we moved in with them. They acted nice at first, but it didn't take long before things got bad. He described the conditions in the basement, the padlocked door, the lack of food, the stifling darkness. Kieran added details about the emotional abuse, the threats that kept them silent for so long. They told us we were lucky to have a roof over our heads, Kieran said, his voice hardening. They said no one would care if we disappeared. As the boys spoke, Hart and Grayson listened intently, jotting down notes but never interrupting. The boys' words painted a grim picture, but the more they shared, the lighter they seemed to feel, as if the burden they had carried for years was finally being lifted. When they finished, Hart leaned forward, her tone resolute. You've done something incredible today, she said. By sharing your story, you've made it possible for us to ensure they never hurt anyone again. Elias and Kieran exchanged a glance, a flicker of hope passing between them. Will they go to jail? Elias asked hesitantly. That's the goal, Grayson said. The evidence we've gathered, combined with your testimony, makes for a strong case. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. After leaving the police station, the boys felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. Mrs. Larkins took them to a nearby diner for lunch, a treat to help distract them from the intensity of the morning. As they sat in a corner booth, enjoying burgers and milkshakes, Kieran leaned toward Elias. "Do you think it'll really work?" he asked. "That they'll go to jail?" Elias considered the question for a moment before nodding. "I think so," he said. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." Kieran gave a small smile, the first genuine one in days. "Yeah. We can do this." Mrs. Larkins watched them from across the table, her heart swelling with pride. Despite everything they had endured, these boys were fighters. And for the first time, she felt they truly believed they were no longer alone. The days after their police interview were quieter but no less significant. Elias and Kieran began to settle into their routine with Mrs. Larkins, though the shadows of their past still loomed over them. Detective Hart checked in frequently, updating them on the investigation and reassuring them that progress was being made. Each time she visited, she brought a little more hope into their lives. One afternoon, while the boys were in the backyard helping Mrs. Larkins plant flowers, Hart arrived with an envelope in her hand. She smiled at the sight of them kneeling in the dirt, their hands covered in soil, and waved them over. "Elias, Kieran," she called, her voice light but purposeful. "I've got some updates I think you'll want to hear." The boys exchanged a glance before standing and dusting off their hands. They followed her inside, where Mrs. Larkins brought out lemonade and cookies, setting them on the table before excusing herself to give them privacy. Hart placed the envelope on the table, her expression turning serious. "We've made progress on two fronts," she began. "First, the case against Paul and Brenda. The evidence we've collected, the padlocked basement, the financial records, and your testimony, has led to their arrest. They're being charged with multiple counts of child abuse and neglect." Kieran's eyes widened. "They're really going to jail?" Hart nodded. "It's not finalized yet, they'll have a trial, but the case against them is strong. And even if they don't serve a full sentence, they'll never be allowed to foster again." Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That's good," he said softly. "They can't hurt anyone else." Hart smiled, but her tone turned cautious as she continued. "The second update is about your past. Remember how I told you there were gaps in your records? Well, we've found something." She opened the envelope and pulled out a series of documents, along with an old photograph. The picture showed a woman in her early 20s, holding two infants, clearly Elias and Kieran. The boys stared at the image, their expressions a mix of confusion and longing. "Who is she?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's your biological mother," Hart said gently. "Her name is Clara Prescott. When you were 2 years old, she lost custody of you due to circumstances that are complicated." "Complicated how?" Kieran asked, his tone sharp. Hart hesitated before answering. "Clara was struggling with addiction at the time. She wasn't able to provide a stable environment for you, so you were placed in foster care. But here's the thing, she got clean a year later and has been trying to find you ever since." The room fell silent as the boys processed this revelation. Kieran's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "She just lost us," he said, his voice shaking. "And no one told her where we were?" Hart nodded, her expression sympathetic. "The system failed her, and it failed you. Your records were mishandled, and by the time she was ready to get you back, you'd already been moved to Paul and Brenda's care. She's been searching for you for over a decade." Elias's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the photo again. "She's been looking for us this whole time?" "She has," Hart confirmed. And she's never stopped. When I contacted her and told her we'd found you, she broke down in tears. She wants to meet you, but only if you're ready. Kieran stood abruptly, pacing the room. I don't know if I can do that, he said, his voice rising. What if she's just like the others? What if she doesn't want us anymore? Elias reached out, placing a hand on his brother's arm. She's been looking for us, Kieran, he said softly. Why would she do that if she didn't care? Hart waited patiently, giving them space to process. You don't have to decide right now, she said. Take your time. Clara understands this is a lot, and she doesn't want to overwhelm you. But if you want to meet her, I'll make it happen. Kieran stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. He glanced at the photo again, his expression softening. I just don't want to get hurt again. Elias nodded, his heart aching for his brother. Me neither, he said. But maybe we should at least talk to her. Hart smiled gently. That's all she's asking for, a chance to talk. I'll leave the photo and the documents with you. Think about it, and let me know when you're ready. As she left, the boys sat together in silence, staring at the photograph of the woman who had given them life. The image felt both foreign and familiar, like a glimpse into a world they had forgotten existed. I don't know if I can forgive her, Kieran said finally, his voice barely audible. Elias looked at him, his gaze steady. You don't have to. But maybe we can at least find out who she is. Kieran sighed, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, he said after a long pause. Maybe we can. A week passed before Elias and Kieran finally told Detective Hart they were ready to meet their biological mother. The decision hadn't come easily. Every night, they had stared at the photograph of Clara Prescott, wrestling with a mix of fear, anger, and curiosity. For Kieran, the fear of being hurt again loomed large. For Elias, it was the hope of finding someone who had truly cared for them all along. On a bright Saturday morning, Detective Hart arrived at Mrs. Larkin's house to escort the boys to the meeting. They were dressed neatly, their nervousness evident in the way Kieran kept adjusting his sleeves and Elias fiddled with the strap of his backpack. Mrs. Larkins gave them each a warm hug before they left. You're braver than you realize, she told them. Whatever happens, remember that you're stronger together. The drive to the meeting place, a quiet park on the outskirts of Ridgewood, was silent. Hart glanced at the boys in the rearview mirror, sensing their tension. You don't have to say or do anything you're not comfortable with, she reassured them. This is your time, and it's entirely up to you how it goes. When they arrived, Clara Prescott was already waiting on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree. She looked exactly like her photo, slim, with auburn hair that fell to her shoulders and soft green eyes that mirrored the boys' own. She stood as they approached, her hands trembling slightly. Her gaze locked onto Elias and Kieran, and tears immediately filled her eyes. Elias, Kieran, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It's really you. The boys stopped a few feet away, hesitant. Kieran's arms were crossed defensively, while Elias stood with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Hart stepped back, giving them space but staying close enough to provide support if needed. Clara took a deep breath, wiping her tears. I don't know where to start, she said, her voice shaky. I've dreamed about this moment for so many years, and now that it's here. I just want you to know how much I've missed you. How much I've loved you every single day. Kieran's jaw tightened, and his eyes flashed with anger. If you loved us so much, why did you lose us? He asked, his voice sharp. Why weren't you there to stop this from happening? Clara flinched, the weight of his words hitting her like a physical blow. You're right to be angry, she said softly. I failed you. I made mistakes that I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I never stopped fighting to get you back. I want you to know that. Elias stepped forward, his voice gentler. Detective Hart said you were struggling. Is that why we were taken away? Clara nodded, her tears spilling over again. I was a mess back then, she admitted. I was young, scared, and I turned to the wrong things to cope. But when I lost you, it was like losing a part of myself. I got help, I got clean, and I've been searching for you ever since. Kieran's arms fell to his sides, his anger giving way to confusion. You've really been looking for us all this time? He asked, his voice quieter now. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a worn journal. She handed it to Kieran, her hands trembling. Every day, I wrote letters to you both, she said. I didn't know if I'd ever find you, but it was my way of staying close to you in my heart. Kieran hesitated before opening the journal. The pages were filled with heartfelt messages, drawings, and even small mementos, like a pressed flower with the note, for Elias and Kieran, my little stars. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elias reached for the journal, flipping through the pages. You really never gave up, he said, his voice breaking. Clara shook her head. Not for a single second, she said. You're my sons. You'll always be my sons. The three of them stood there in silence, the tension between them slowly dissolving. Finally, Elias stepped forward and hugged her. Clara gasped softly, wrapping her arms around him as fresh tears streamed down her face. Kieran watched them, his emotions a whirlwind. He still felt conflicted, but seeing the raw love and regret in Clara's eyes stirred something inside him. Tentatively, he stepped forward and joined the embrace. Clara held them tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, I'm so sorry. For everything. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me. Elias and Kieran didn't respond, but the fact that they stayed in her arms spoke volumes. For the first time, they felt the warmth of a mother's love, a love they had longed for but never thought they would experience again. Detective Hart watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. She knew this was only the beginning of their journey, but it was a powerful step toward healing. As they left the park later that afternoon, Clara held their hands tightly, as if afraid to let them go. Elias and Kieran didn't pull away. For the first time in years, they felt like a family again. In the weeks following their reunion with Clara, Elias and Kieran found themselves navigating a whirlwind of emotions. Their initial meeting had opened the door to a relationship they never thought possible, but rebuilding trust and forming a bond after so many years apart wasn't easy. Clara respected their pace, never pushing too hard but always making it clear that she was there for them. The court case against Paul and Brenda loomed large over their lives. Detective Hart worked tirelessly to ensure justice, keeping the boys updated every step of the way. The trial was scheduled for the following month, and Elias and Kieran were prepared to testify. It was a daunting prospect, but they knew their voices could make a difference. Meanwhile, Clara spent as much time with them as possible. She visited them frequently at Mrs. Larkin's home, bringing small gifts, books for Elias, who loved to read, and art supplies for Kieran, who had discovered a talent for sketching. These thoughtful gestures slowly chipped away at their initial hesitations. One sunny afternoon, Clara invited the boys to her home for the first time. It was a modest house with a cozy porch, a flower garden, and a welcoming warmth. As they stepped inside, Elias and Kieran were struck by the framed photos lining the walls. Many of them were of the boys as toddlers, taken before they were separated. Clara had kept them all, a testament to her unwavering hope. I never stopped thinking about you, Clara said as she guided them to the living room. This house has always been meant for the three of us. Elias ran his fingers along the edge of a photo frame, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Kieran lingered near the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Why didn't you move on? Kieran asked suddenly, his voice quiet but tinged with curiosity. Why didn't you just forget about us? Clara turned to him, her expression soft but serious. Because I couldn't, she said simply. You're my sons. No matter what happened, you were always a part of me. I knew I had to keep fighting for you. Kieran's gaze softened, and he nodded slightly, though he didn't say anything more. Over the next few hours, the boys explored the house while Clara cooked dinner. She made spaghetti with homemade marinara, a dish she remembered they loved as toddlers. As they sat around the table, the conversation flowed more easily than any of them expected. Clara shared stories from their early childhood, moments they couldn't remember but found comfort in hearing. You used to love playing with building blocks, Clara said, smiling at Elias. You'd stack them as high as you could, and when they fell, you'd clap and laugh like it was the best thing in the world. Elias grinned, a warmth spreading through him. I guess some things never change, he said. I still love building stuff. Clara turned to Kieran. And you were my little artist. Always drawing on anything you could get your hands on. I still have one of your scribbles framed in my bedroom. Kieran raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. Scribbles? He asked. I'm pretty sure I was a prodigy. They all laughed, the sound filling the room with a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. As the evening wore on, Clara brought out a box of keepsakes she had saved over the years. Inside were more photos, hospital bracelets from their birth, and a small book of poems she had written during her recovery. The boys sifted through the items, each one a tangible reminder of her love. When it was time to leave, Clara walked them to the car, her heart full yet heavy. You don't have to decide anything now, she said. I know this is all new, and I don't want to rush you. But I hope you'll think about moving in with me. I want to give you the home you've always deserved. Elias and Kieran exchanged a glance, their silent communication speaking volumes. We'll think about it, Elias said, his voice steady but kind. As the car pulled away, Clara stood on the porch, watching them disappear into the distance. She felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Back at Mrs. Larkin's house, the boys sat in their shared room, reflecting on the day. Kieran pulled out his sketchbook and began drawing absent-mindedly, while Elias flipped through one of the books Clara had given him. What do you think? Elias asked, breaking the silence. Kieran didn't look up from his drawing. About moving in with her? Yeah. Kieran sighed, setting his pencil down. I don't know. It's a lot. But she seems real, you know? Like she actually cares. She does, Elias said firmly. You can tell. And I think I want to give her a chance. Kieran nodded slowly. Yeah. Me too. The next morning, they told Mrs. Larkins their decision, and she couldn't hide her joy. I think it's a wonderful idea, she said. You deserve to be with someone who loves you unconditionally. A week later, Elias and Kieran moved into Clara's home. The transition wasn't without its challenges, there were moments of doubt, anger, and sadness. But with time and patience, they began to feel like a family again. On the night of their first Christmas together, the three of them sat by the fireplace, exchanging small, thoughtful gifts. Clara handed the boys matching bracelets engraved with the words "Always Together." They slipped them on, their eyes misting as they read the inscription. For the first time in years, Elias and Kieran felt truly at peace. Their journey had been filled with pain and uncertainty, but now, sitting with their mother in the glow of the firelight, they knew they had found their way home. This story is a powerful exploration of resilience, love, and the quest for justice. It delves into the emotional scars left by neglect and abuse while shining a light on the courage it takes to speak out and reclaim a stolen childhood. Elias and Kieran's journey is both heartbreaking and inspiring, showing us the strength of family bonds, even those fractured by time and pain. Clara's relentless determination to find her sons is a poignant reminder of the depth of a mother's love. Her imperfections make her human, and her redemption arc underscores the idea that it's never too late to make amends. The boys' decision to trust again is a testament to their bravery, proving that even the most wounded hearts can heal with time, patience, and unconditional support. Ultimately, this story carries an uplifting message. While the past may be unchangeable, the future is a blank canvas waiting to be filled with hope and love. It's a narrative that challenges us to confront our own fears, forgive where we can, and believe in the possibility of new beginnings.